eating out to help out with a bill of about £400 million. The job retention scheme, so far, about £35 billion.
And the knowledge you need.
And today, the start of the Kickstart job scheme for young people at £2 billion. But even as the economic stimulus rolls out, there is a looming question. Who will pay for it and how? The government sees an autumn budget as the start of trying to put the public finances back on a sustainable footing. And after years of spending cuts, it seems likely that tax rises will have to take the strain. Given the sheer scale of spending in this pandemic, the Chancellor's message seems to be that there are tough choices ahead. In the last financial year, the government borrowed a total of £57 billion. It borrowed close to that just in April as it spent to prop up a locked-down economy. And in the first 4 months of this financial year, it's borrowed over £150 billion, nearly 3 times the previous year.
Hello.
Even with today's very low borrowing costs, some argue we need a fiscal plan in place now.
Even before COVID hit, the OBR were predicting that the public sector net debt was going to get to almost 300% in the next 50 years. So the problem was there already. But also, and I think really crucially, we have a real intergenerational problem here. So if we keep kicking the can down the road, then we're leaving it for our children, their children's children, to have to pick up and pay off this debt. And we currently have one of the wealthiest generations of pensioners who have been massively protected right past 2008 to today. And at some point, we're going to have to raise taxes on them.
One problem is that before the crisis, the big three, income tax, national insurance and VAT, were expected to account for 63% of government receipts. These are the taxes the government has pledged not to increase the rates that people pay. Hence the recent focus on other areas where the Treasury could make gains, including corporation tax, capital taxes like inheritance tax or capital gains, and fuel duties. Finding significant sums may require tackling tricky areas of tax reform like property, pensions and other wealth, and that would likely take time, despite any signals about swift action. The Chancellor may want to start balancing the books, but the trouble is they are still very much in flux. Now, there is a school of thought that says the government just shouldn't worry as much about deficits, and certainly not while the economy is in the doldrums. But many of those who accept the need for tax rises also think they shouldn't start this year, with unemployment likely to be rising, the economy fragile, and COVID still a threat.
Big challenge this autumn is making sure that the rise in unemployment that we'll see is kept to the absolute minimum. That needs to take priority alongside making sure we keep this virus under control, which in the end is what will determine the depth of the economic hit. Actually, really, this debate that we're seeing at the moment is really about whether you announce those measures in the short term at the same time maybe as announcing more support for the economy. So you announce giveaways, but then you also say where you will take money away in future. And in the end, that's going to come down to a judgment about where the economy is and whether you need to balance the message of support for the economy with tough choices on fiscal policy.
For any Chancellor, handing out the money is the easy bit. Whether it's between the government and the electorate or the government and backbenchers, much trickier conversations lie ahead.
And Thompson, joining me now, the Conservative MP for South Leicestershire, Alberto Costa, Labour's Shadow Treasury Minister, Wes Streeting, and Professor Ngaire Woods, Chair of Oxford University's Blavatnik School of Government. Good evening to you all. First of all, Alberto Costa, we've heard both from Helen and from Nick what is ruled out by way of the manifesto, which accounts for about 60% through VAT, NI and income tax rates. So where should the Chancellor go? He's going to go somewhere. Where should he go to get money?
Well, I think the Chancellor is right to say that we need to treat the British people with respect and be honest with them. The British people want us to be honest about how we pay for the COVID pandemic measures which the Conservative government have undertaken. Now, I've long advocated, for example, a hypothecated tax for the National Health Service. And I think that the British public are probably ready to have a ring-fenced, earmarked tax, for example, on the NHS. And I'll continue to champion that sort of measure. But I do think, Kirsty, in addition to just specific tax policies, I think we need to now stretch out across the House of Commons our arms and say, look, we need a cross-party agreement specifically for the NHS and adult social care on how we go forward, because that's a huge sum of money going forward, which will help meet some of the money that we've been spending on COVID.
But there is going to be some form of taxation. On the 11th of August, the OBR predicted borrowing could go up to £391 billion this financial year. I mean, so what we're talking about, are you comfortable there's going to be, what, low taxation, eye-watering borrowing and no cuts to services? You know, that doesn't add up in the calculator. There'll have to be some form of tax rises beyond a hypothecated tax, which obviously isn't government policy.
Look, we need to be honest with the British people, and they would want nothing other than honesty. And we do need cross-party support on the big issues such as funding for the NHS. But I do think, Kirsty, that the government, that money is cheap at the moment. Interest rates are historically at a low level. And I think the Prime Minister's comments about build, we can, to an extent, build our way out of the crisis that COVID has created.
So just very briefly, so you actually think we just keep borrowing because money is cheap? It doesn't matter how much we borrow?
It depends how you see whether money is borrowing or not. It's an investment on public infrastructure. For example, in my own constituency, I've got one of the new UK prisons about to be built, one of these large prisons. And what I would be advocating to the government, and as I am indeed championing, is that as we've come out of the EU and public procurement contract rules are different, we could target some of that spending to local SMEs. So yes, we'd be borrowing money, but we would be investing it in SMEs that desperately need that investment.
West Judy, is there anything there that you disagree with, or is this real a cross-party consensus? Would you mind a hypothecated tax on the NHS? Do you mind because money is incredibly cheap? Just keep borrowing. Do you think build is a good idea? Well,
listening to Alberto, I wish he was speaking for the government, because lots of what he was saying there made a great deal of sense, but I'm not clear that that is what Rishi Sunak is saying. Going into this autumn, the absolute priority, the focus of the Chancellor has got to be on preventing already extraordinarily high levels of unemployment becoming even higher and ingrained structural unemployment in our country of a type we haven't seen for decades. And at the moment, the Chancellor's wedded commitment to rolling back furlough prematurely, to not providing support for whole categories of self-employed people who've previously been excluded, these sorts of things are not only causing real anxiety to people, they actually risk increasing the economic damage to our country, both in the short term and the longer term.
But what about what Nick Watt was talking about with the possibility of a stealth tax, the possibility that your personal allowance is frozen, and that, in a say, is the fiscal drag that will actually raise some money for the Treasury?
Well, at this point, we're at the beginning of what looks to be the worst recession in 200 years. This is not a time for tax rises, but in the in the medium term, of course, there are going to be painful choices for the Chancellor to make, but the extent of those painful choices will be determined on how quickly you can get the economy back to growth. And that means an active industrial strategy and making sure that our country is as best placed to recover from the economic challenge of COVID-19 as possible. At the moment, some of the Chancellor's short-termist thinking, his stubbornness, inflexibility when it comes to things like the furlough scheme, which has so far been a successful intervention,
let me put this
risk making his job harder.
Let me put this in Ngaire, with the combination of furlough and, as it probably is, masking deep unemployment to come, would there be any point in raising taxes? You know, what would actually govern the tax take?
So, first, every country in the world is facing this same problem. It's not just a British problem coming out of COVID. And the essence is going to be, in Britain, whether money that's now being spent is an investment in a more resilient and growing Britain. Now, I think what's special about Britain is that business leaders who are going to be the drivers of that growth are really coming together to say, look, government has now earned the right, because it's done furlough, because it's done loans, because it's helped business on behalf of British society, it's helped business in its time of need, and it's earned the right to set a new deal with business. And that's why I think the language around seizing this opportunity to build back a better Britain is an important one, because there is a new resolve across both business, some parts of government, and certainly communities across Britain to do that. The essence to me is whether the government can learn, as so many governments have had to learn in other countries, that to build back better means to build back in a very place-based local way. So that's hard for governments that want to rule from London or from the capital city and control from there.
And we'll pick that up in a moment. But just before we do, I wonder if you heard Charlotte Pickles say there that who's going to be picking up the tab for this whole business, and it is going to be the generational divide. And maybe, as you say, building back better is going to actually offset the fact that it's the next generation, the younger generation, as well as partly the wealthier older generation, that's going to have to pay in the future in their taxes for this pandemic.
Well, if there aren't jobs for the 18 to 25-year-olds who are the next generation, if we can't create jobs, if Britain can't create jobs for those people, the evidence is if they stay unemployed during that period of their life, they probably won't have jobs for their entire lives. So actually, building in a way that builds jobs for this next generation is a huge part of what building back better means.
Right. I want to pick up now, Alberto, with something that Ngaire's just said there about the relationship between Whitehall and local authorities and local indeed. I mean, you're from Leicester, constituency is Leicester. How do you deal with uncertainty for small businesses if they are trying to reboot themselves in business? Because you've got a situation where you're locked down, then you're being told you're not locked down, and actually that whole alchemy isn't working at the moment, is it?
Well, actually, Kirsty, this isn't just a matter for national UK government. We've seen today that the devolved Scottish executive has had issues with Glasgow, East Renfrewshire and Western Bartonshire, areas that you and I both know well. And your views in those parts, I heard on BBC Radio 4 earlier today, some listeners from Bishop Briggs, for example, the town that I grew up in, north of Glasgow, were confused as to exactly where these new lockdown restrictions would apply. So it's not just an issue that the national UK government has to deal with, it's an issue also for the devolved governments of the UK. But look, and also, my constituency was one of the first to experience a local lockdown, and there are lessons to be learned. And I think the principal lesson that we need to learn going forward is communication. There must be much better communication.
And there seemed to have been very little of that, as we heard earlier in Bolton, because in fact they wanted to stay locked down, and the government with very short notice said you have to open up and then you have to close down again. So there is a problem with communication. But West Streeting, isn't the government right that Matt Hancock says he has to move decisively? He has to move quickly when there's an outbreak so it can be stamped out before there is contagion.
I think the challenge on the public health front is that the government has been far too centralised in its approach, and we'd be better off working through local authorities. And this ties in, by the way, to the wider point we've just heard, particularly from Ngaire, about the need for a place-based approach to our economic recovery as well. It is no coincidence that this country has not just one of the most unequal economies in Western Europe and one of the most regionally imbalanced, but also one of the most centralised systems of government. That's got to change by not just devolving power, but also giving more resources to local communities. They can build more resilient economies, more responsive public services. So that needs a fundamental cultural shift in attitude. Also look back at the last Labour government and what we did with an activist approach on things like life sciences, which, during the last recession, we invested in life sciences, and look at how that's borne fruit. Let's think about the future economies and the future opportunities, particularly around the green economy, and think about where we can make wise investments today for tomorrow.
Thank you all very much indeed.